So overnight, our church grew, and it wasn't something that we planned, not some kind of big strategic plan or anything like that. It just grew overnight, and we doubled in about 3 months, nearly doubled again within the next year, and it was an exciting time. And my days were full, my lunch and breakfast appointments, my evenings were beginning to get packed, and not only that, I was getting opportunities to speak to different groups of people, to travel around, and it was exciting, it was exhilarating, and I would come home from work and just crash on the couch. And my wife, Grace, who really lives up to her name, most gracious woman in the world, God gave me a double portion of grace. She would try to calm our 4 children who were under 6 and under from climbing on top of me, and just give the guy 5 minutes, give him 5 minutes to relax. And I was just thrilled about all that God was doing in and through our church. And so all that I thought about all the time was the church and different opportunities that we had to share the gospel with people and people getting saved. I mean, more than half the people in our church were non-Christians during that season. It was so exciting. And it was like our ministry was an airplane that was just beginning to take off. And my wife was home with 4 kids, 6 and under. And so while my airplane of ministry was just beginning to fly like this, she just wanted me to take the garbage out. In fact, there were times where as my ministry opportunities began to increase and our church began to grow, that my wife would get increasingly frustrated. And there was some kind of tension between us that neither one of us could put our finger on. And so I would constantly say to her, listen, do you just want me to quit my job? And she said, no, I want you to be home. And I realized that as ministry was growing, my trajectory was changing and my wife's trajectory was staying the same. And that could only last for so long before these 2 airplanes are very, very far apart. And a wonderful mentor of mine said, Noel, what you need to do is you need to find a way to stitch those airplanes together so she is flying with you. You know, being a pastor, being a church planter, being an elder in a church is a very unique job in the sense that your marriage is part of your qualifications, which means if you are a bad husband, you are unqualified to be a pastor in Jesus' church. Let me say it again. If you are a bad husband, you are unqualified for the ministry. Now, every marriage is unique. And there's a lot of times you'll go out there and you'll read all these marriage books and websites and seminars, and you'll think, oh, here's the ticket, here's the key. I just need to have the weekly date night. If I have the weekly date night, then everything's going to be fantastic and I can just keep moving on. Well, I'll tell you what, my wife doesn't like the date night. What she likes is me being home with our 4 children, doing things together. Every marriage is unique. And so your job as a pastor, as a church planter, as an elder, as a man, is to study your wife and figure out what makes her tick. How do I be a good husband to this particular woman? It's just like churches. I mean, most of us have visited a lot of churches, especially during the church planting season. You go out and you visit this church and that church, big churches, little churches, and there's always stuff you like, stuff you don't like, stuff you want to do, stuff you don't want to do. And there is no one mold for how a church ought to be, and there's no one mold for how a marriage ought to be. You know, there's the central passage of how to be a good, godly husband that we have, many of us have just taught on and read for years. And we're going to go through this really familiar passage again in Ephesians 5. In Ephesians 5, starting in verse 25, this is what it says. Husbands, love your wives. And here's how we're to love our wives. As Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. That's our responsibility, men, is to love our wives in such a way that we give up our lives. And so many people in our culture, they want to fight against a male headship and our responsibility as men to lead in our homes. But the way we lead in our homes is laying down our lives, giving our lives up for them, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Sanctify is to set something apart in a unique category. And so what you're doing with your wife is you're taking her and placing her in a category that no one else gets to live in. And you put her in this place, and then I love how he says, sanctify her by the washing of the word. It's your responsibility, husband, to figure out how to help your wife navigate the whole being married to a pastor, dealing with kids at home, being all those sorts of things, the fishbowl of ministry. And you do that through the Word. Sanctify her with the washing of the Word. So here's the purpose, that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. So when my wife says to me, I just want you to be home, she has told me how she wants me to be, where she wants me to be. Now, I can look at her and say, well, that is just unreasonable. Ministry is growing. There are non-Christians that I need to sit down with and share the gospel with. There's people with crisis in their marriage. I need to sit down with them. What she's asking is unreasonable. But I love what Paul admonishes the Ephesians here in. He says the goal of this sanctification is to set her apart as holy and to present her to himself as pure and spotless, without any wrinkle or blemish. That is how we are to see our wives. And so we look at those things and say, this is a pure and good and holy thing. And again, it is laying down our lives. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one has ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church. Jesus is our ultimate example in this. So how do we start? Well, here's where we start. Men, study your wives. A lot of church planters, a lot of pastors are entrepreneurial types who love to exegete culture and figure out what is the best way to present the gospel in this unique culture. We like to exegete scripture. What exactly does the Greek and the Hebrew say in these sentences? Well, men, exegete your wives. Study them. And here's the beautiful thing, and I might get myself into trouble here. Your wife is going to constantly change throughout the course of your marriage. The woman you married is not the same woman she's going to be. Women go through different hormonal changes over the course of their life, and it's a good and godly thing. And with children and eventually even with menopause, guys, you're going to be married to like 5 or 6 different women. You have the opportunity to study these 5 or 6 women in this one woman over the course of your lifetime. Exegete your wife. Figure out what makes her tick. How does she need you to care for her? And how can you then present her to yourself as pure and spotless, without wrinkle or any other blemish, which means those little things that are quirky, that drive you crazy. The fact that when you're just flying off on ministry and she wants you just to be home, they may drive you crazy. Take a step back. Don't allow it to drive you crazy anymore. Say, this is awesome. I love the fact that my wife wants me to be home. That's how you start loving and cherishing your wife.